December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m., Lanzerath Ridge, Belgium. The ground is shaking. 20-year-old Lieutenant Lau Bauk can feel it through his boots, through the frozen earth of his foxhole, through his bones. He clutches his rifle tighter. His breath comes out in white clouds that disappear into the pre-dawn darkness of the Ardennes forest. Around him, 17 other men wait in silence. Teenagers, most of them. College kids. Expert marksmen pulled from an experimental army program and assembled into an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. They were never supposed to be here. They were never supposed to fight. But in 60 seconds, when 1,600 German artillery pieces unleash hell across an 80-mile front, these 18 soldiers will become the only thing standing between Hitler's last desperate gamble and the roads that lead to Allied supply depots, to the port of Antwerp, to a German victory that could change the outcome of World War II. Lau Bauk doesn't know any of this yet. He just knows the shaking won't stop. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, an army is coming. This is the story of how 18 American soldiers held off more than 500 German paratroopers for nearly an entire day. How they delayed the entire northern wing of the German offensive by 20 hours. How they inflicted over 400 casualties while suffering 0 combat deaths. And how, for 37 years afterward, not a single one of them received any recognition for what they did. The boy who wouldn't quit. To understand what happened on that frozen ridge in Belgium, you have to understand the kid in the foxhole. Lau Joseph Bauk Jr. was born December 17, 1923, in St. Louis, Missouri. The Depression was crushing America. His father was a carpenter, moving the family constantly, chasing work that barely existed. Young Lau watched his parents struggle. Watched them worry about putting food on the table for their children. So at 14 years old, he lied about his age and enlisted in the Missouri National Guard. Not to see combat. Not for glory. For money. To help his family eat. He was a kid doing a man's job. And he was good at it. Disciplined. Focused. By 16, he'd made supply sergeant. The other soldiers respected him, even though some of them were twice his age. There was something about the quiet kid from St. Louis. Something that made you believe he'd get the job done, no matter what the job was. In December 1940, when he was still just 17, his unit was activated for federal duty. He participated in the Louisiana maneuvers, massive training exercises involving tens of thousands of troops. While other teenagers were worrying about girls and homework, Lau Bauk was learning logistics, learning leadership, learning how to keep men alive. Then came Pearl Harbor. Everything changed. By 1942, Bauk's regiment was being shipped to the Aleutian Islands, a frozen, miserable posting at the edge of nowhere. But Bauk had other ideas. He volunteered for officer candidate school. Most of the instructors probably looked at his application and saw just another eager kid who'd wash out in a week. They were wrong. Bauk didn't just survive the 4 months of intensive training at Fort Benning, Georgia. He graduated in the top 10 of his class. At 19 years old, he became one of the youngest commissioned officers in the entire United States Army. Think about that for a moment. 19 years old. Most teenagers today are figuring out their major in college, stressing about exams, wondering what they want to do with their lives. Lau Bauk was leading men in preparation for war against Nazi Germany. But here's what makes this story so remarkable. The Army didn't send him straight into combat. They kept him at Fort Benning. They made him an instructor. For an entire year, this 20-year-old officer taught defensive tactics to other officers, many of them older and more experienced. The brass recognized something in him that transcended age and experience. He had it. That indefinable quality that separates competent leaders from exceptional ones. In 1943, Valk finally got his combat assignment. He was transferred to the 99th Infantry Division, a green unit, inexperienced, heading to Europe for the first time. And within that division, he was given command of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment. The INR platoon was supposed to be the regiment's eyes and ears. 18 men organized into 2 9-man squads. Their job was reconnaissance, sneaking through enemy lines, gathering intelligence, capturing prisoners, finding out where the Germans were, what they were doing, how strong they were. They weren't frontline troops. They weren't supposed to hold defensive positions. They certainly weren't supposed to fight off battalion-strength attacks by themselves. But Lieutenant Valk didn't pick ordinary soldiers for his platoon. Every single man was an expert marksman. Peak physical condition. Many of them were former members of the Army's Specialized Training Program, a now-defunct initiative that had pulled the smartest, most capable soldiers for advanced education. When that program was abruptly terminated, those soldiers got reassigned to regular units. Valk got the pick of the litter. Technical Sergeant William Slape, Private First Class William James Sakanicas. Men who could hit a target at ranges most soldiers couldn't even see. Men who'd been selected because they were smarter, faster, more adaptable than average infantry. They trusted their young lieutenant. And he trusted them completely. In November 1944, the 99th Division deployed to Belgium, taking over positions in the Ardennes sector from the more experienced 9th Infantry Division. It was supposed to be a quiet posting, a place where green troops could ease into combat without too much pressure. The Ardennes was heavily forested, hilly, difficult terrain, the kind of ground where large-scale attacks were considered nearly impossible. American commanders assumed the sector was safe. They were catastrophically wrong. The gathering storm. While American soldiers settled into what they thought would be a quiet winter, Adolf Hitler was planning the impossible. By December 1944, Nazi Germany was dying. The Allies had liberated Paris. Soviet forces were crushing the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. American and British armies were pushing toward the Rhine, toward the German heartland. Every strategic indicator said Germany had lost. Surrender was inevitable. Hitler refused to accept it. In September 1944, despite the protests of his own generals, Hitler began planning Operation Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. It would be a massive counteroffensive through the same Ardennes forest that had been Germany's path to victory in 1940. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity. Assemble 30 divisions in complete secrecy. Over 200,000 men. More than 1,000 tanks. Hit the weakest part of the Allied line with overwhelming force at dawn. Punch through to the Meuse River within days. Capture the critical Belgian port city of Antwerp. Split the British and American armies. Destroy 4 Allied armies in detail. Forced the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. Then shift all forces east to hold off the Soviets. It was Hitler's last throw of the dice. His final gamble. And every one of his commanders knew it probably wouldn't work. But it might. If they could achieve complete surprise. If the weather stayed bad enough to ground Allied aircraft. If they could move fast enough, hit hard enough, create enough chaos before the Allies could respond. If everything went perfectly. The Germans chose their attack point carefully. The Losheim Gap, a natural corridor through the difficult terrain of the Ardennes. Through this gap ran roads that led to the Meuse River and beyond. Control those roads, and the panzers could race west before the Americans knew what hit them. But those roads passed through a tiny Belgian village called Lanzerath. Population, maybe a few dozen. A cluster of houses, a cafe, a church. Nothing strategically important, except the high ground just east of the village. A ridge overlooking the roads. Perfect for observation. Perfect for defense. And on December 10, 1944, Lieutenant Laubach received orders to take his entire 18-man platoon to that ridge and establish an observation post. Watch the roads, the order said. Report enemy movement. You're the regiment's eyes on the right flank. Nobody expected them to fight. Bauch and his men moved into position. They found some abandoned foxholes left by the previous occupants and improved them. Dug deeper. Created interlocking fields of fire. Bauch scrounged extra weapons. A .50 caliber machine gun, additional automatic weapons. His men zeroed their rifles on key terrain features. The fence line in the field below. The approach roads. The tree lines. Just in case. For nearly a week, nothing happened. The platoon conducted their reconnaissance missions. Sent out patrols. Monitored German movements. It was cold, boring work. The kind of duty where you start to think nothing interesting will ever happen. On December 15th, Bauch's men spotted something unusual during a patrol. German columns moving at night. More traffic than they'd seen before. Bauch reported it up the chain of command. The reports were noted, filed. Nothing seemed urgent enough to worry about. That night, Bauch couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. He checked on his men in their foxholes. Made sure ammunition was distributed. Weapons ready. Just in case. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the artillery started. The day everything changed. Imagine standing in a forest when the world explodes. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across an 80-mile front. Trees disintegrated. The ground heaved. The noise was indescribable. A continuous roar that seemed to tear the air itself apart. But Bauch's position was just outside the main artillery barrage zone. Far enough that they weren't being shelled directly. Close enough that every man in those foxholes knew, with absolute certainty, that something massive was happening. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. For the first few hours, Bauch and his men could only wait. Watch. Try to figure out what was happening. Their radio communications were spotty. The regiment was under attack. Everyone was under attack. There was confusion, chaos, conflicting reports. Then, around mid-morning, one of Bauch's men spotted something that made his blood run cold. German soldiers. Not a patrol. Not a platoon. A column. Marching down the road toward Lanzerath. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. Paratroopers. Elite troops from the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division. And they were heading straight for the village. Straight for the roads Bauch was supposed to be watching. Behind them? The 1st SS Panzer Division. Joachim Paper's battle group. Tiger tanks. Panther tanks. The spearhead of the entire northern offensive. Lieutenant Bauch faced an impossible decision. His orders were to observe and report. His platoon wasn't equipped or trained for sustained combat. They had no anti-tank weapons. No artillery support. The guns were all engaged elsewhere. No reinforcements available. No way to stop what was coming. The tactically sound decision would be to withdraw. Fall back to friendly lines. Report what he'd seen and let someone else deal with it. But Bauch looked at those roads. He knew that if the Germans got through, they'd have a clear path west. Those panzers would roll. The entire offensive would gain momentum. Men would die. Maybe the battle would be lost. He looked at his 18 soldiers in their foxholes. Expert marksmen, every one. Good defensive terrain. Prepared positions. Maybe they could slow the Germans down. Buy some time for the rest of the division. Balck made his choice. "We hold," he told his men. "We hold at all costs." He was 20 years old. In 63 days, he'd turned 21. And he'd just committed his platoon to a fight that would define the rest of their lives. The longest day. The German column entered Lanzerath around midday. Over 500 paratroopers from the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. Veteran soldiers. Well-equipped. Confident. They had no idea 18 Americans were watching them from the ridge above. Balck let them pass. Let the lead elements move through. He was waiting for the main body. For the officers. For the moment when the maximum number of enemy troops would be in the kill zone. Then a teenage girl ran out of a house in the village. Ran straight to what looked like the German command group. She pointed toward the ridge. Toward Balck's position. Whether she was trying to warn the Americans or inform the Germans, nobody knows. But the element of surprise was gone. The German commander made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of the day. He assumed the Americans on that ridge were a small patrol. Maybe a squad. Nothing significant. He ordered a frontal assault. One full company, over 150 paratroopers, to sweep up the hill and clear out the position. The Germans attacked across an open, snow-covered field, gently sloping. Over 100 yards of completely exposed ground with a fence running parallel to the American foxholes. They never had a chance. Balck waited until they were close. Then he gave the order. 18 rifles opened fire in perfect synchronization. The .30 caliber machine gun. The .50 caliber. Every weapon zeroed on that fence line, on the approaches, on the killing field they'd prepared. The Germans went down in waves. The survivors dug for cover in the ditches along the road. Tried to return fire. But they couldn't see where the Americans were. The foxholes were perfectly camouflaged in the snow-covered forest. The muzzle flashes were impossible to pinpoint. The Germans regrouped. Sent another wave. Another company surging up that hill with submachine guns blazing, shouting, trying to overwhelm the position through sheer aggression. Balck's men cut them down. Again. And again. And again. The Germans couldn't believe what they were facing. How could such a small position generate so much firepower? The paratrooper battalion commander assumed he was facing at least a full American regiment. Maybe more. He called for reinforcements. Called for artillery support. But Balck's position was too close to the German troops below. Artillery would hit their own men. The Germans were stuck, pinned down by 18 soldiers who refused to break. Hours passed. The Germans tried flanking maneuvers through the forest. They hit tripwires connected to grenades. More casualties. They tried rushing from multiple directions simultaneously. The interlocking fields of fire tore them apart. Lieutenant Balck moved between foxholes, coordinating fire, encouraging his men, exposing himself to enemy fire to get better vantage points. He was everywhere, completely calm, directing the defense like he was conducting a symphony. His men fed ammunition into their weapons until the barrels glowed. They fired until their shoulders were bruised from recoil. They held. As afternoon faded into evening, the Germans finally tried something different. They infiltrated through the forest in small groups. Quietly, carefully, avoiding the prepared kill zones. Around 50 paratroopers managed to get inside the American perimeter. They moved from foxhole to foxhole, clearing them one by one. In Bauch's position, a German soldier fired directly into the foxhole. The lieutenant took a round in the leg. His foxhole mate, Private Sakanikas, was shot in the face. A devastating wound that nearly killed him. One by one, the positions fell silent. The 18 men of the INR platoon surrendered. Except for one. Private First Class Robert Lambert had been killed in action. The only American fatality of the entire engagement. The Germans were furious. They'd been held up for nearly 10 hours by what they discovered was less than a platoon of soldiers. Over 400 German casualties. Some estimates put it as high as 500. An entire battalion decimated. When Joachim Paper, the commander of the 1st SS Panzer Division, finally arrived at Lanzerath just after midnight, he was livid. His entire battle group had been stuck behind this single point of resistance for 12 hours. 12 hours behind schedule. The road should have been open at dawn. His subordinate officer explained that they'd been pinned down by an entire American regiment. Paper demanded to see the prisoners. He counted 18 men. 18. His face went white with rage. He screamed at his subordinate. Then he personally led a battalion of paratroopers into the forest to verify it was actually clear. He couldn't believe that fewer than 20 men had done this. But they had. The entire northern wing of the German offensive, the main effort of Hitler's last gamble, fell hopelessly behind schedule. Instead of reaching the Meuse River on the first day, they went almost nowhere. The 6th Panzer Army, which was supposed to be racing toward Antwerp, sat stuck in traffic behind Lanzerath. 20 hours of delay. 20 hours for American reinforcements to move into position. 20 hours that would help determine the outcome of the entire Battle of the Bulge. Author Alex Kershaw would later write, "Had they not stood and held the Germans and halted their attack, or rather postponed it for a crucial 24 hours, the Battle of the Bulge would have been a great German victory." 18 American soldiers. One 20-year-old lieutenant. A decision to stand and fight when withdrawing would have been perfectly justified. They changed the course of the war. The price of valor. But victory came with a cost that couldn't be measured in casualties or strategic impact. The captured Americans were marched to the cafe in Lanzerath that served as the temporary German headquarters. Most were wounded. All were exhausted. They'd fought for their lives for nearly an entire day. They'd run out of ammunition. They'd been overrun. And they'd lost. That's what Lieutenant Bauch thought. He didn't know about the delays. Didn't know that his platoon had single-handedly disrupted the timetable of Germany's last offensive. He just knew his men were prisoners, that he'd been wounded, that he'd failed to hold the position forever. "We were in those foxholes," he would say decades later, "and what we did was to defend ourselves and try to live through it." The Germans loaded the prisoners who could walk onto trucks. The seriously wounded, including Sakanikas, went separately. They were jammed into railroad cattle cars. Bauch's car held 72 men. No food. No water. They traveled for days. By Christmas Day, 7 men in Bauch's car had died. The rest were barely hanging on, surviving only through sheer will. They ended up in POW camps in Germany, starving, freezing, watching as the Reich collapsed around them. In April 1945, Patton's 4th Armored Division attempted to liberate one of the camps, but couldn't rescue everyone. Bauch was recaptured by the Germans, then finally released in May, 1 week before the war ended. He was so weak he couldn't file a combat report. He spent months in hospitals recovering. His men were scattered across different camps. Some barely survived. But eventually, they all came home. home to a country that didn't know what they'd done. Remember, due to their capture and the general chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, the platoon's actions weren't documented. No combat report was filed. The unit's disposition was unknown to American commanders. As far as the Army was concerned, they'd just been another unit that got overrun in the opening hours of the German offensive. Lieutenant Balck didn't think what they'd done was particularly remarkable. They defended themselves, tried to survive. Then they'd been captured. In his mind, that was a failure. He returned to St. Louis, reconnected with a fifth-grade classmate, Lucille Zinzer. They married in April 1946. He got his high school equivalency diploma, attended chiropractic college on the GI Bill, graduated in 1949, and started a practice. He never talked about the war. His wife Lucy would say decades later, "He never talked about it." Never. None of the men did. They tried to forget, tried to move on with their lives, build careers, raise families, be normal. But Lyle Balck couldn't completely let it go, because he knew what his men had done. He knew they'd held when they should have been overrun, knew they'd fought with skill and courage that deserved recognition. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, the U.S. Army published its official history of the Battle of the Bulge. Historian Hugh Cole mentioned Balck's platoon in passing. A footnote. A brief mention. One of Balck's men, William Secanikas, who'd taken a bullet in the face and survived, read that passage and was furious. He contacted Balck and told him they needed to get proper recognition for what the platoon had done. Balck started writing letters to the Army, to his former division commander, Major General Walter Lauer, to anyone who would listen. In June 1966, a silver star arrived in Balck's mailbox. Just his. None of his men had been recognized. He was upset, not honored. A silver star for him meant nothing if his soldiers got nothing. So he kept writing, kept pushing. His story appeared in John S. D. Eisenhower's book, The Bitter Woods, which told their story in detail. Columnist Jack Anderson campaigned to get William Secanikas the Medal of Honor. It took 15 more years. On October 26, 1981, 37 years after that day on the ridge, the men of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon were finally recognized. 14 of the original 18 were still alive to attend the ceremony, hosted by Secretary of the Army John O. Marsh. Every single member of the platoon received the Presidential Unit Citation. 4 men received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valor. 5 received the Silver Star. 9 received the Bronze Star with V device for valor. They became the most decorated American unit of their size in all of World War II. Lieutenant Lyle Balck, now approaching 60 years old, stood there as they pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on his chest. He'd spent more than 3 decades fighting for his men's recognition harder than he'd fought the Germans on that ridge. A reporter asked him about that day, about what it felt like to hold off 500 enemy soldiers with just 18 men. "We were frightened and we were tired, and it was like a hellish nightmare," Balck said. "It seemed it would never end. We couldn't get any help. It seemed like it was all hopeless." But they didn't retreat, didn't surrender until they had no choice, didn't break, because that's what Lieutenant Lyle Balck had taught them. That's what the 19-year-old instructor from Fort Benning understood better than officers twice his age. You don't measure success by whether you win or lose. You measure it by whether you do your duty, by whether you stand when you're supposed to stand, by whether you fight when you're supposed to fight, by whether, when the ground is shaking and an army is coming and every rational calculation says you should run, you look at the men beside you and say, we hold. The aftermath and the lesson. The Battle of the Bulge raged for another month after that first day at Lanzerath Ridge. The Americans ultimately prevailed, but at staggering cost. Between 80,000 and 100,000 American casualties. The bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. The Germans suffered similar losses, casualties they couldn't replace. Hitler's last gamble failed. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat. The war would be over in 4 months. But that first day mattered. Those 20 hours of delay at Lanzerath mattered. The northern shoulder of the Bulge, the direction where the main German thrust was supposed to break through, became a sticking point that the Germans never overcame. The 99th Infantry Division, supposedly inexperienced and unprepared, held. Reinforcements arrived in time. The German timetable collapsed. All because a 20-year-old lieutenant and 18 soldiers decided to stand their ground. Laubach lived to be 93 years old. He died on December 2, 2016, just 15 days before the 72nd anniversary of that day on the ridge. He'd been married to Lucy for 70 years. They had 5 children. 2 of his sons became U.S. Navy pilots. He practiced as a chiropractor for nearly 50 years, treating patients, living a quiet life in Missouri. He was a charter member of his local Lions Club, served his community, was, by all accounts, a good man, a humble man, the kind of man who, when asked about the greatest day of his military career, would say, "We were in those foxholes, and what we did was to defend ourselves and try to live through it." He never saw himself as a hero, never wanted the attention, never sought glory. He just wanted his men recognized for doing their jobs under impossible circumstances. That's the paradox of true heroism. Real heroes rarely think what they did was extraordinary. They were just doing what needed to be done, making the decisions that had to be made, standing when standing was required. Because here's what Lieutenant Bauck understood at 20 years old that many people never learn. Leadership isn't about being the toughest or the smartest or the most experienced. It's about being there for the people who depend on you. About making the hard calls. About setting an example that others can follow. When those German paratroopers were charging up that hill, Bauck's men kept fighting because their lieutenant was moving between foxholes, exposed to fire, completely calm, showing them that terror could be controlled, that chaos could be managed, that they could do this. When the army forgot about their actions for 37 years, Bauck spent decades fighting for his men's recognition, because that's what leaders do. You take care of your people. Always. Even when it takes decades. Even when nobody's watching anymore. The story of Lanzerath Ridge has gained more attention in recent years. Historian Alex Kershaw wrote, "The Longest Winter," in 2004, bringing the platoon's actions to a wider audience. Military strategists study the battle as an example of how well-trained, well-positioned small units can punch far above their weight. In 2019, the Army Times published an article about how Bauck's stand holds lessons for modern warfare, particularly as the military pivots toward preparing for potential conflicts against peer adversaries like Russia or China. Scenarios where American units might find themselves isolated, outnumbered, without support, having to hold critical positions against overwhelming odds. The kind of scenario Bauck's platoon actually faced. And won. But there's a deeper lesson here that transcends military tactics or historical analysis. On December 16, 1944, 18 American soldiers, most of them teenagers, were given an impossible mission. They could have withdrawn. They could have followed their training, which said INR platoons don't engage in sustained combat. They could have made the tactically sound decision to preserve their force and fight another day. Instead, they looked at those roads, at the German army coming through, at what would happen if nobody stopped them, and they decided to try. Not because they thought they'd win, not because they knew their names would be remembered, not because anyone would thank them for it, because it was the right thing to do. Because sometimes you stand not because you think you'll prevail, but because someone has to stand. Because the alternative, letting evil roll past unopposed, is unacceptable. That's what real heroism looks like. Not the Hollywood version with dramatic music and slow-motion explosions. The real thing. The unglamorous thing. The thing where you're cold and scared and exhausted, and you do it anyway because people are depending on you. The Lieutenant's Legacy. December 16, 2044 will mark the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. By then, every veteran of that battle will be gone. The last living voices of what happened on that frozen ridge will have faded to silence. But the story endures. In classrooms, young people learn about World War II. Most know about D-Day, about Pearl Harbor, about Hiroshima. Fewer know about the Bulge. Fewer still know about Lanzerath Ridge. But military historians know. Officers studying defensive tactics know. Anyone who's ever wondered what they would do when faced with an impossible choice and no time to think, they know. Lieutenant Lyle Bauch's legacy isn't measured in medals or monuments. It's measured in the lives saved by the delay his platoon imposed on the German offensive, in the Allied victory that his stand helped secure, in the soldiers who study his tactics and learn what's possible when training meets courage meets leadership. It's measured in the fact that 18 men went to war together, fought together, survived captivity together, and all but one came home. That's not luck. That's leadership. The equipment from that day is long gone. The rifles corroded. The foxholes filled in. The ridge where they fought looks like any other piece of Belgian forest now. Peaceful. Quiet. Beautiful even. But if you stand there at dawn in December, when the frost covers the ground and your breath comes out in white clouds, you can almost feel it. The shaking ground. The distant artillery. The weight of an impossible decision settling onto the shoulders of a 20-year-old lieutenant from Missouri. And the moment when he looks at his men and says the words that will echo through decades. We hold. We hold at all costs. That's not just a military order. It's a philosophy. A worldview. A decision about what kind of person you want to be when everything's on the line. Lyle Bauch held. His men held. They bought 20 hours with their blood and their freedom, and their willingness to stand when running would have been justified. In the arithmetic of war, 20 hours doesn't sound like much. But in the calculus of courage, of sacrifice, of doing your duty when nobody's watching and nobody will thank you for it, 20 hours can change the world. 18 men. One lieutenant. One impossible day. And a legacy that reminds us, 8 decades later, that heroes aren't born from superpowers or divine intervention. They're born from ordinary people making extraordinary choices when the moment demands it. When the ground starts shaking, what will you do? That's the question Lieutenant Bauch answered on a frozen ridge in Belgium in 1944. And his answer echoes still. Lieutenant Lyle Bauch Jr. died December 2, 2016, at age 93. He was married to Lucy for 70 years and had 5 children. The Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, 394th Infantry Regiment, remains the most decorated American unit of its size from World War II. All 18 members received the Presidential Unit Citation. 4 received the Distinguished Service Cross. 5 received the Silver Star. 9 received the Bronze Star with V device. only one member, PFC Robert Lambert, was killed in action at Lanzerath Ridge. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 41 days and resulted in over 80,000 American casualties. It was the bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. The German offensive failed. The war in Europe ended 4 months later.